Imagine, if you will, a patient. They're lying on an operating table. The room is cold, the air smells of antiseptic and, I don't know, old iron.
Okay.
This patient is fully awake, wide-eyed, just staring up at the peeling paint on the ceiling. And they are watching, in real time, as their own organs begin to shut down one
Yeah.
by one. The liver fails, the kidneys stop, the heart starts to stutter.
It's the stuff of nightmares.
But here's the kicker, and this is where it gets truly unsettling.
Mhm.
The surgeon standing over them, well, they don't try to sedate the patient. They hand the patient a scalpel, their own hands shaking, and say, "You have to operate on yourself right now. Cut open your own chest and fix the heart, or you die in the next hour."
Wow.
And just to make it worse, the lights in the hospital are flickering out because the neighboring empires are cutting the power line.
That is a terrifying image. But, having gone through this stack of research on Chapter 5, I honestly cannot think of a more accurate metaphor for what we're tackling today.
It definitely sets a different mood than what we usually associate with the word enlightenment. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the Polish Enlightenment. Specifically, we're looking at the years between, roughly 1750 and 1830?
That's the time frame.
And looking at these notes, we're not heading to the sunny, optimistic salons of Paris or the coffee houses of London, are we?
No, we are heading east, and that distinction is vital. In France or England, the Enlightenment was, in some ways, an intellectual luxury. It was born from stability, from confidence. Think of Voltaire saying, "The future is bright, let's solve the universe."
Whereas in Poland,
In Poland, the Enlightenment wasn't a luxury at all. It was a race against time. It was an intellectual explosion happening inside a collapsing state. The patient in your metaphor is the Polish Commonwealth, which was literally being carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria.
so they weren't just writing books for the library.
No, they were forging tools to stop the bleeding. They were performing an autopsy on a living body, their own nation.
So our mission today is to understand the mechanics of that surgery. We're looking at how Polish philosophy transformed from what the sources call Sarmatian darkness into a desperate, razor-sharp weapon. But before we get to the solution, we have to understand the sickness.
The context.
Yeah, the sources keep mentioning this time warp. Where exactly was Poland intellectually when this all started?
Poland was effectively living in a ghost town in the mind. While Western Europe was moving into the mid-18th century with scientific methods, Poland was just stuck in the 17th century. The intellectual life was dominated by a very rigid, decaying form of scholasticism.
Scholasticism, that's one of those terms we hear a lot. For the listener who hasn't touched a textbook in a decade, can we pin that down, or we're just talking about being religious?
It's more about how you think. In this context, it meant an obsession with ancient authority, like a corrupted version of Aristotle and abstract logic games. The universities in Krakow or Wilno were fortresses of the past.
So they weren't teaching science.
They were teaching students how to construct these incredibly complex arguments about metaphysics, but completely ignoring the scientific revolution happening right next door. They weren't looking at the world, they were looking at old, dusty texts.
So you have a 17th century mindset trying to survive in an 18th century geopolitical Shark Tank.
Exactly. And the Polish Enlightenment is really the story of trying to close a 100-year gap in about 30 years. It happens in 3 distinct phases. You've got this early German phase, which was sort of warm-up, then the French phase, which is the radical surgery, and finally the late phase, the mourning period after the state collapses.
Let's stick with that lag for a second. You said the universities were fortresses of the past. If they were stuck in the mud, where were these new ideas coming from? Usually you'd expect the professors to lead the charge.
That's the irony, and it's unique to this region. The heart of the Polish Enlightenment wasn't a university at all. It was Warsaw. And at the time, Warsaw didn't even have a university.
That seems like a massive disadvantage.
It was actually their greatest advantage. It meant there was no entrenched old guard to fight. Warsaw became this blank slate buzzing with coffeehouse debates, new periodicals, a hunger for reform. The ideas were coming from political activists and writers who realized the house was on fire.
Okay, so let's talk about the enemy they were fighting inside that house. We mentioned Sarmatian darkness. This sounds like a fantasy villain, but what does it actually mean?
It refers to Sarmatism, the dominant ideology of the Polish nobility. They believed they were descended from ancient Sarmatian warriors. It created a culture that glorified xenophobia, resisted all change, and championed this very specific chaotic form of liberty.
This is where we run into the liberum veto, right? I've read about this and it blows my mind. A single nobleman could halt the entire parliament.
Not just halt it, dissolve it. and annul all legislation passed in that session. It was completely paralyzing. But here's the key insight from our sources. The reformers didn't just attack this as a bad law.
Yeah.
They attacked it as a bad way of thinking. They diagnosed it as a mental defect of the nation.
Enter Stanisław Konarski. He seems to be the first heavy hitter in our stack.
Absolutely. Konarski was a purist monk, but don't let the robe fool you. He declared war on the Polish educational system. He realized the state was failing because the nobility was being trained to be irrational.
That is blunt.
He was blunt. He argued the liberum veto wasn't freedom, it was a failure of logic. If you prioritize the whim of one person over the survival of millions, you're not free, you're just being irrational. So he set up the Collegium Nobilium.
A school for the elite.
Yes, but designed to breed a completely new kind of citizen. He banned the old abstract logic games. He brought in modern history, geography, politics. He wanted to create citizens who could actually govern.
This push for education leads to one of the most surprising facts in this whole deep dive. Poland is collapsing, armies are at the borders, and they invent the Commission of National Education.
The world's first Ministry of Education in 1773.
Why? Why prioritize that when you can probably be building forts?
Because they realized they couldn't outgun Russia or Prussia. Their only hope was to outthink them, or at least to make sure the next generation could rebuild. It was a long-term survival strategy in the middle of a crisis. And the curriculum shift was radical. They threw out Aristotle and brought in Condillac.
Okay, hold on. We need to unpack that. Why does swapping Aristotle for Condillac save a nation? Who is Condillac?
Étienne Bonneau de Condillac was a French philosopher. He was all about sensualism.
Sensualism? That sounds a bit racy for a Ministry of Education.
It's not racy at all. It's really just empiricism, the idea that all knowledge comes from the senses, from experience.
Right.
Aristotle's logic, as it was taught then, was about syllogisms, word games.
Right, proving things based on definitions.
Condillac's logic was, look at the world, what do you see? Gather facts, make a decision.
I see. So the old way is, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man.
Exactly. Abstract deduction. Condillac is. There are 50,000 Russian troops on the border. Our supply lines are cut. Therefore, we must do X, Y, and Z. It was instrumental. In a collapsing state, you don't need to debate angels on a pin. You need to calculate logistics. Logic became a tool for survival.
This shift toward cold, hard facts brings us to the man I found the most fascinating and, frankly, a little intimidating. Jan Cieniedecki.
The cold surgeon, yes.
He's a mathematician and astronomer. And reading his work, he seems to have absolutely zero patience for anything he can't measure.
Zero. Cieniedecki is the embodiment of this anti-metaphysical turn. He believed that abstract speculation, wondering about the essence of being or ghosts, was dangerous. It distracted the mind from concrete reality.
He actually had a hierarchy of truth, didn't he?
He did, and it tells you everything. At the very top, mathematics, absolute certainty. If you can calculate it, it's true.
And below that?
Theoretical physics. He called it phenomenal certainty. Still very high trust. But then you get to the bottom, biology and social science.
Which is where politics lives.
Precisely. He called those fields only probabilistic. He basically said, look, living things and societies are messy. We can guess, but we can't be 100% sure.
That's a pretty harsh take for a social reformer.
But it was honest, and it explains why he hated the German philosophers so much.
Yeah.
Immanuel Kant was taking Europe by storm at this time, but Cieniedecki rejected him vehemently.
Why? Kant is usually considered the peak of Enlightenment thought.
Cieniedecki felt Kant's language was just obscure, a new fancy version of the old scholastic fog. He basically said, we are fighting for our lives here. We need clarity. We need math. We do not need German mysticism. He saw human knowledge as fragile, and if you clutter the mind with unprovable ideas, you weaken the nation.
It's almost like he's treating the national intellect like a computer disk. Delete the junk files. We need the processing power.
That is a perfect analogy, and he wanted that processing power directed at one thing, the state. This brings us to the political diagnosis. You can't separate the philosophy from the politics here.
All right, we have to talk about Hugo Kuśtierz and Stanisław Staszic. These guys weren't just academics.
Kuśtierz was the radical organizer, the forge of the reform. Staszic was the brooding observer, the sociologist before sociology even existed, and their diagnosis of Poland was ruthless.
Staszic wrote this massive work, The Human Race, and he had a very specific argument about what makes a nation a nation.
Yes. He looked at the Polish system where only the nobility had rights, maybe 10% of the population, and he said, this isn't a country, this is a corpse. He argued that a nation built only on nobility is doomed to fail.
He pushed for the rights of townspeople and peasants.
And he connected freedom directly to property. He argued that you cannot be free if you don't own your own labor or land. It was a direct attack on serfdom. And he just flipped the script on the liberum veto again. He called it despotism of the one.
That's a powerful phrase. We usually think of despotism as a king.
Right. But Stasek said if one person can stop the will of millions, that is tyranny. True liberty, he argued, requires the ability to govern collectively. He was diagnosing the anarchy of the nobility as the cancer killing the patient.
All of this intellectual work, Konarski's education, Shiniedeki's facts, Stasek's sociology, it all culminates in one moment, doesn't it? The Constitution of May 3rd, 1791.
The peak, the first modern constitution in Europe, second in the world only to the U.S.
We hear about that date, but based on these sources, it feels like it was the final exam for this entire school of thought.
It was the application of reason to chaos, a desperate attempt to codify a rational society before the neighbors dismantled the house. But you have to see the tragedy here. It was a triumph of the mind, enacted just as the body of the state was about to be crushed.
That tension is palpable in their writing. They're writing about the inevitable progress of history, that humanity always moves forward at the exact moment their own history is being erased.
It's haunting. Stasek's The Human Race is this massive poem about social evolution, humanity struggling from savagery to civilization. He's arguing progress is a law of nature.
But how do you square that with Russia parking cannons on your lawn?
That's the paradox. Krucha had an unfinished work where he argued that history has laws, just like physics.
And if you break them?
You suffer the consequences. He argued Poland broke the laws of history by neglecting its social structure, by ignoring reason, and now it was paying the price. It wasn't bad luck. It was a failed equation. They were asking for a correction, not pity.
That's a heavy burden. Now, I want to pivot slightly. If history is physics and politics is math, where was God in all this? Poland is traditionally very Catholic. Did they kick God out of the equation?
They didn't kick him out, but they essentially promoted him to management. They moved toward deism.
The clockmaker God.
The grand clockmaker. The idea that God built the universe, set the laws of physics in motion, and then stepped back to let it run.
This leads to a very specific argument against miracles that Kujataj used. I found this to be a classic Enlightenment gotcha.
It really is. Kujatai asked, if God is perfect, and he created the laws of physics to be perfect, why would he ever need to intervene with a miracle? A miracle is a suspension of natural law. If God has to break his own laws, it implies he made a mistake the first time.
So relying on miracles is actually an insult to God's competence.
Exactly. It's a brilliant rhetorical move. It lets you be religious and completely scientific, but they were also pragmatic about it. Jan Shinadeki, our cold Sojin, argued that even if you don't believe, religion is necessary for the social machine.
Utilitarian, keeps the gears greased.
Yes, you need the church to teach morals so people don't kill each other. But this created this massive tension with the traditionalists who felt that if you strip away the mystery, you leave the universe cold and empty.
And then the lights go out. 1795. The final partition. Poland ceases to exist as a state. The patient dies on the table.
And this is where the story shifts dramatically, the late phase, after the catastrophe.
So what happens to the doctors? What happens to the philosophy when the patient is dead?
Well, the survival tools of the French phase, the empiricism, the focus on statecraft, they suddenly seem less useful. You can't reform a state that doesn't exist.
And this is where the German fog finally rolls in.
Yes. Immanuel Kant arrives. And this is the great conflict at the end of this chapter.
A young Kunyadeki must have been furious.
He fought it until his dying breath. He wrote essays attacking Kantian philosophy, but the younger generation, including his own brother, Jadze, started to listen. They tried to blend Kant with Scottish common sense philosophy.
Why? What did Kant offer that Schneedeke's cold facts didn't?
Solace, comfort. Kant offered a turn inward. If the external reality is ruined, if your country is gone, your flag is banned, you turn to the internal reality. To the mind, the spirit, the moral imperative inside you.
That makes perfect sense psychologically. If you can't control the world, you control your soul.
Exactly. Jan Siniadecki feared this would detach Poles from reality, creating a nation of dreamers. He thought it was dangerous. But the younger generation looked at the partition and said, reason failed us, logic didn't save the borders, we need something else.
This transition really sets the stage for the Romantic era that follows, doesn't it? The shift from reason to spirit.
It does. They started looking for a metaphysical meaning in their suffering, something Siniadeki's cold math simply couldn't provide. The chapter ends right on that precipice, the moment where the cold light of reason starts to dim and the ghostly lanterns of romanticism start to flicker on.
So let's zoom out. We've gone from dusty schoolrooms through the frantic, sharp surgery of the reformers to the quiet aftermath. What's the big takeaway here? Why does this specific slice of history matter?
The tragedy of the Polish Enlightenment is that it was, arguably, an intellectual success, but a political failure. They successfully reformed the mind of the nation. They created the first Ministry of Education. They wrote a brilliant constitution, but they were too late to save the body of the state.
It's like building the perfect engine for a car that's already driving off a cliff.
In a way. But I would argue it wasn't a total waste. And this is the critical insight. Think about the 123 years that followed. Poland didn't exist on the map. But the Polish nation, the culture, the language, the identity survived. Why?
Because of the upgrade.
Because of the surgery. The Enlightenment reformers created a culture that was robust enough to survive without a state. They created a phantom limb.
Phantom limb.
You know how when you lose an arm, you can still feel it? The Polish Enlightenment made the idea of Poland so strong, so rational, so structured, that even when the political body was amputated, the mind kept feeling the limb. It kept the nation alive in the realm of ideas for over a century.
They built a mind strong enough to outlive the body.
That's it. That is a haunting thought, isn't it? The patient died, but the mind kept dreaming in the darkness.
And because the mind survived, eventually the body grew back.
But that's a story for another era. For this chapter, we leave them in the dark, armed with nothing but their books and their logic, waiting for a dawn that wouldn't come for a century.
It leaves us with a provocative question. If a nation dies politically, but its philosophy survives, is it actually dead? Or did these cold surgeons in their race against time actually discover the secret to immortality?
Sometimes the operation is a success, even if the patient doesn't walk out of the hospital immediately.
We'll leave you in the quiet dark with that thought. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.